Hello and welcome. My name is Joe O'Mara. I'm the head of aviation finance with KPMG. And on behalf of KPMG and Airline Economics, I'm delighted to be joined again by Helane Becker. Helane is a managing director with COWEN. Helane, before we get into maybe the meat of the topic today, do you want to give our watchers a brief introduction to yourself and COWEN?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. And it's good to be here again. Thanks very much for the time. So I'm Helane Becker. I cover from the research side, the airline, aircraft leasing and logistics industries. I've been doing it, that I admit to, more than 35 in less than 40 years. I try not to think about that too much. And COWEN is an investment bank. We focus on healthcare. It's probably our largest vertical. And then cannabis, which is relatively new. We also focus on consumer technology, energy, and the kind of upcoming technologies. So in addition to doing the work on airlines and aircraft leasing, I've been doing some work on new technologies like hydrogen powered aircraft and eVTOL, things that are going to disrupt aviation over the next 2 or 3 decades. So that kind of keeps me going, given how volatile the airline sector has been over the last almost 3 years now.
Well, we would definitely look forward to probing some of those areas. Probably not cannabis, but we can get another podcast out of that at a different date. But definitely on those disruptive technologies when we pick up maybe around climate change and ESG impact. But in the first instance, Elaine, can I ask you, as you look at ultimately the airlines and performance and how they've gone, how have you seen that? Clearly, COVID's been the greatest disruptor we've ever seen. We are nearly 2 years into that disruption at this stage for most of the world. How have you seen performance on the airline side financially evolve over the course of this year?
Yeah, it's kind of been interesting, Joe. We've seen 3 segments of the industry really different in terms of, well, I guess both geographically and segment wise. So leisure demand has been very, very strong. It probably came back a lot stronger and a lot faster than we thought it would. Maybe not, probably, definitely. I think we thought initially that the economy, especially in the United States, which is one of the world's largest economies, would go into a recession, and it would take a long time for people to feel comfortable traveling again. But the US government was very supportive of both the airlines and its people. And the population as a whole gave people money to stay home. And usually when you have money, you don't have time to travel. And when you have time, you don't have money. But in this case, people had both. And we saw very, very strong demand, especially in the summer of 2021, where people felt more comfortable. They'd been vaccinated. They felt comfortable traveling. I mean, let's face it, the message from governments early on in this pandemic was stay home to stay safe. And then as we moved through it into 2021, it was, well, get vaccinated to get back to some semblance of normalcy. And so people rightly did that. And we can talk about the issues that this swarm of people created, especially in the US. But in Europe, you saw the same thing. Folks traveled in Europe. So I'll call that a domestic market. The transatlantic wasn't as robust in 2021 as we think it will be in 2022. And Asia Pacific is because they're island nations and they still have a lot of restrictions and a lot of quarantines in place. We actually think Asia Pacific is a 2023, 2024 event before traffic in those markets come back.
Can I pick up a thread on something you mentioned there was obviously the return in leisure and divergent views on this around commercial or business travel. What are your thoughts on that market and its importance to the sector more generally, which sometimes can be overstated?
Right. So here's the thing, Joe. I've always thought it was more important for airlines to make their money on leisure and view business as gravy rather than make their money on business and view leisure as a necessary part of the overall business. If we cater to you when you travel for business, we should carry you and your family when you're traveling for leisure. And it kind of got all twisted up because obviously the difference between the highest business fare and the lowest leisure fare is so astronomical. And the airlines have been doing somewhat better at narrowing those gaps, A, and B, because of that, you've seen people buy up from the lowest economy fares to higher economy fares to be more comfortable when they travel. So we view that really favorably. As far as business goes, I think business is coming back probably 80% of the way back. And here's why. First of all, if you are new to a business, you have to meet people and you have to, the best way to network and build your network is through conferences and conventions. And we're actually seeing conference and conventions stronger than I think people thought they would. A big test is going to be the beginning of January when the Consumer Electronics Show is held in Las Vegas. We've already seen United add lots of flights, 109 flights returning January 8th to the 10th and 91 flights going from January 3rd to the 5th. So clearly, at least one airline thinks we're going to see strong business travel. Then as far as meetings go, people don't mind the Zoom call, but there's lots of technology issues and they don't always go through. They're not as it's not as good as being in person. I mean, I would love to be doing this in person again and really miss you and miss folks. And so I think you're going to see people come back when they start to return to office. I think they'll start to think about those business trips. And I think you're going to see at least 80% of the way back. As far as leisure goes, I mean, clearly there's lots of pent up demand, and I think summer 2022 is going to be really crazy on the North Atlantic. I think people are going to want to travel, especially if it's a little bit easier maybe than it's been, given all the testing. And I mean, all of it gets kind of tiresome after a while.
Yeah, and just to ask you, as you're looking and assessing the airline market, and I actually fully agree with you on business, right? Business is about gaining an advantage. You're not going to get that sitting in your office, Zooming potential clients and your current customers. And can I ask you on airline performance, as you're looking at kind of the metrics and you're evaluating the investable nature of those types of entities, what are you looking at now? Is it still all about cash as it was maybe 12 months ago and who could survive, or how wide are you thinking when you're thinking of the metrics from a creditworthiness perspective?
Yes, I think there's three things to think about. One is cash and liquidity. That definitely goes without saying. I think what you're going to see is the airlines keep a higher cash balance than they have historically in the event something like this happens again. I mean, this is about as bad as in any event you could even conjure up. I mean, I think when people think about what could go wrong, it's always an economy going into a recession in one part of the world or another. It's never the whole world going down at the same time. So I think you'll see higher cash balances. I think in terms of cash flows and debt repayment, I think what you're going to see airlines do is two things. One, pay down debt as it comes due to free up assets so that they do have unencumbered assets to re-encumber at some point in the future. And then the last thing is on the loyalty programs, airlines have definitely discovered that they can monetize their loyalty program without giving up control. And I think that that's not something they want to do, but I think it's something that having that in their back pocket and the ability to tap that in for cash in a pinch, I think is very helpful. I think in terms of overall, the big question that came up a year ago was, will an airline go bankrupt? Or maybe a year and a half ago, will some airlines go bankrupt? And because of the huge government support, you really did not have that. And of course, in the US, you're not going to see more consolidation, maybe among smaller players, but I think this administration is not going to approve any kind of bigger deals. You may see more consolidation around the world where maybe there is not as much government support and where airlines are just going to run out of cash because they didn't have that big summer inflow of passengers that would drive cash flow through the winter.
And do you think on the opportunity side, we talk about those distressed balance sheets, we might talk about what that means in a second on the financing piece, but is there opportunity for the airline 2.0 for new startups to come in, clean balance sheet, and take advantage of what we believe will be freeing up that pent up demand if we get to a mostly unrestricted world from a travel perspective.
Yes, I do. I think in the US, you already have 3 new startups, I want to say. I think there's Breeze, there's Avelo, there's Global X, Global Crossing. They call themselves Global X. There's 3 different models. Breeze is using A220s. There's AHA, which is kind of a virtual airline using the old ExpressJet operating certificate. Global X is an ACMI provider. I think I might be missing one in there. Oh, Aviation is a scheduled service provider using 737. So you do have new startups in the US. I think that that's historically what happens in the airline industry, right? You have airlines that come, airlines go, airlines come, airlines go. Management teams kind of get recycled. The aircraft leasing companies are willing to put aircraft into airlines for a price. Obviously, tier 1 airlines pay less than new startups or tier 3 airlines. But yeah, I think that's one thing about the industry. You can always find 2 pilots, a plane, and people who are willing to fly it. And the other thing, Joe, you didn't ask me about this, but the other development we're seeing is companies like Blade and Wheels Up, private flying, right? A lot of, especially C-suite and boards are concerned about allowing their folks to fly commercial, at least in the middle of the pandemic. And so they allowed them to fly private when they otherwise might not have. And that's a whole nother aspect of the business that's going to be really interesting in the next, say, decade.
Yeah, and it might feed in, as you say, to that. And when we get to that ESG chatter, a little bit around smaller aircraft and the potential for those to be used in those ways. And can I ask on the financing side in the leasing market, we've clearly seen an uptick in the percentage of funded aircraft on the lessor side. So we were chatting to Airbus recently, and they talked about how 50% a couple of years ago, probably mid-high 50s now. Do you see that pandemic giving rise to a sustainable shift in the level of aircraft that will be owned by lessors?
Yes, in a word. So Joe, I've never thought it made sense for any airline company to own aircraft. I understand why they do, of course, right? They're the largest buyer, they get a good deal, they're going to fly the planes for 20 to 30 years. But when you think about the residual value risk, especially of late model aircraft, it makes more sense to let someone else own the aircraft. So yes, I think that you're going to see, and that's part of it. The other part of it is some governments told their airlines, well, we'll give you $1 billion worth of money, but you have to buy $6 billion worth of aircraft that are younger, more fuel efficient, and that will lower your carbon footprint. You see a lot of governments attach green strings to the amount of financing they were willing to do to support the industry. So, and we should talk about that, ESG and as it affects the industry and my views on that, because I think that's really important for the next decade. But yeah, to your point, I definitely think that there's opportunity for the airlines in that regard.
And looking at that on the lessor landscape, how competitive do you see that being on the challenge on lease rate factors and the challenge is just to either have scale or increase scale for the lessors that are in the game?
Yes, so you have one lessor that's huge now, and everybody else is smaller by comparison. Scale matters. It just does. It's important. I think AerCap, Avalon, Air Lease, 3 of the biggest, have proven that it makes sense to be big. They get the first call, and they know everybody. They know where aircraft are. They know how to get aircraft. They protect their investment. And they don't play generally in the lower quality sort of sale leaseback market, right? You don't see Air Lease in that business that much. AerCap's been in that business. Avalon's done some. The large companies tend to deal more with the OEMs. They'll do deals, obviously, if the lease rate factors make sense, but they're not about to put their capital, it seems to me anyway, that they're not about, or at least they haven't, put their capital at risk in an environment where they can't recoup their investment. And I think that's really important.
Can I ask what you think that might mean for the other players? Because we've seen, obviously, you mentioned a couple of the very large ones, IG rated, can tap the unsecured market in a really impressive way over the last 12 months when you look at the quantum raised and the interest raised. When you look beyond those large players, what is that going to mean for those guys when you don't have the ability to tap that kind of funding at those rates?
Yeah, I think those guys are going to fall behind. They're going to have to take bigger risk, which means lesser quality on credit. And it mean, it's sort of a catch-22, right? They're going to have to take more risk with who they put their aircraft into, which means charging a higher rate to cover their cost of capital because it's greater. And then for the airline that's getting the aircraft in the event of a downturn, they're in a bind because they can't afford the higher rate that they're paying. But yeah, I also think it's going to drive consolidation at that lower level, and it may drive privatization. So I don't know, 7 years ago, I covered 5 publicly traded aircraft leasing companies, and 3 of them have been bought by private enterprise or banks, and now I cover 2. So and I don't do the debt side, I do the equity side, so it really narrowed things up for me. But you have to I have to pay attention to everybody, right? Because it's critically important to know what's going on.
And because as you say, I guess that consolidation point is interesting, because totally agree. Like there's a logical piece to this, the consolidation follows. And you kind of say, you go back a decade plus ago, the top 3 probably had 70%, probably pre the GCAS deal, the top 3 had about 30% of what that market is. And I kind of agree with you that you would think there's going to be a contraction in those large lessors and the percentage that they have. The corollary to that is the new platforms and all this capital trying to find a home. So your thoughts on our likelihood of seeing new players of scale and seeing the next, it's probably like Aviation, or ALC are still relatively young corporates, 10, 12 years old, but the likelihood of seeing someone of that scale emerge over the next couple of years, how likely do you think that might be?
I don't think it's going to happen in the Western markets, just because the scale, it's going to be hard to duplicate, right? You just don't have the you may not have the capital. Rates are going up, or theoretically rates are going up. But it may happen in China, and it may happen in Asia. In fact, it's very likely to happen in China because those Chinese airlines are growing, or were growing pretty rapidly pre-pandemic. It looks like the China domestic market is kind of back to where it was pre-pandemic. Internationally, they're grounded. But over time, we definitely think that you can create a large lessor in that market. But I think, to your point, it's going to be hard to build that scale in elsewhere in the world.
And picking up maybe the theme on the debt markets, I know you're predominant equity focused, but one of the things that has been interesting has been probably the return of aviation ABS. So if you look at, when that market shut after the financial crash in 2009, it took half a decade to come back in any real meaningful way. The bounce back here, has it surprised you as to how quickly aircraft ABS have come back?
Actually, yes. And a lot of things have surprised me in the past year about how quickly things came back. I mean, I mentioned that I was surprised at how fast, especially domestic leisure, came back in the United States. So yes, ABS, it really did surprise me because I didn't think capital would be that available. But it turns out that I think there are a lot of people chasing yield, and it's hard to find with rates so low, even though they may be heading higher. If you need yield and you need return, yeah, I mean, you come back into the market. But yeah, it's totally surprised me how much money and capital is available for this industry. I mean, surprised in a pleasant way, by the way.
And just on a macro question on that, do you think there's a squeeze coming, right? So the probably broad expectation, we're in for some interest rate hikes over the course of 22. How do you feel that macro environment might squeeze the aviation sector if it comes to pass that we do see increased rates?
So here's how I think about that. In order to have a robust economy, you need a robust airline industry. The airline industry, and you've heard me, Joe, you and I have talked about this before, you've heard me say this, the airline industry is so important to the world, just in general, and you see that. The only reason we've been able to distribute 8 billion of 10 billion vaccinations out there is because of the airline industry, right? We have FedEx, we have UPS, we have the world's passenger airlines who are able to turn. I mean, think how quickly our passenger airlines turn to cargo and we're able to move PPE and the like. So I think that that's critically important from a macro perspective. The way I think about the whole leasing industry is, it goes back to an earlier question, which is, without the leasing industry, a lot of smaller airlines wouldn't survive either, and wouldn't be able to do the refleeting, wouldn't be able to meet demand. And I think it's all intertwined and very important.
Can I ask you, coming back to the piece, which is obviously probably the existential issue facing the world, and clearly aviation, climate change, ESG. As you look at it, how, when you are assessing either lessors or airlines, is just general ESG and climate concerns feeding in to your outlook on those types of entities?
Yeah, so Cowen is taking the lead in this area. My boss is very passionate about this. I'm very passionate about this. We've been talking about this since 2017, 2018. The sustainability aspect of it, the governance aspect of it, and I'm going to divide them up into those two sectors, right? So from a governance perspective, we've been talking about this for a long time within the aviation sector. Lots of men, not a lot of women, not a lot of diversity. And we're talking about trying to build that diversity with ISTAT University, with a focus on women in diversity in aviation. I think you probably are aware that United Airlines has their Aviate Academy. They're going to hire 10,000 pilots this decade. They would like half of that to be diverse in women, gender diversity and racial diversity. So I think that's very important from that perspective. And increasingly, investors are focusing on it. Our biggest investors are focusing on it. And the management teams, the boards, are starting to think about, and this is not only true in aviation, it's true in other industries, compensating executives on their performance with respect to the governance and the diversity part. So diversity, inclusion, culture, so on. Now let's talk about the sustainability and the environment part. So here's the thing. Aviation is a small contributor to overall emissions. We're just big, and when people see the contrails in the sky, they get all panic stricken. But the reality is, 80% of emissions are produced by 20% of flights, and those 20% of flights are fewer now. That was kind of pre-pandemic number, and because you just don't have as much capacity going from Asia to the United States. I mean, think about China to the United States. Pre-pandemic, there were over 100 flights a week. Now there are less than 10 a week. I mean, it's gotten significantly lower. What I've said that I think is very important is, if the airline industry, and I don't mean just airlines, I mean aviation in general, if we don't take the lead on this, the governments will, and we're not going to like what's done, and what's required of the industry. It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's not going to accomplish a lot. Every airline that we talk to is either investing in SAF, and of course, what are the two elements that you can quickly lower emissions? One is improving air traffic control and more direct routing, and the other is through the use of SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. Every airline has said, we're there to buy it. What you need to do is scale it, and you need to make it cost effective for us. I think United's taken a lead on this. Southwest has talked about American, Delta. Everybody is focused on SAF, and those just in the US. And you have the European airlines doing the same thing. A lot of airlines, I mean, think about Air France and KLM. They accelerate a retirement, in one case of A380s, the other case is 747s. You have a lot of that going on. A380 fleet the world's fleet has gotten significantly smaller, which improves emissions. You can buy carbon offsets, although that's kind of not helpful because you're still putting the emissions in the air. There's carbon recapture and sequestration that United and others are focused on, but the easy fix is SAF, is scaling that and making it cheaper.
And thinking about it from an investor perspective and looking at maybe at the finance market, do you see a split in the interest that investors take versus the interest that maybe lenders take? Have you seen more diligence on the investor side and understanding kind of your broad ESG mix versus on the debt side, or do you think there's a similar interest?
I don't know the answer to that question. I guess I would pick it's a similar interest because a lot of our clients are asking us about ESG, and we put an ESG score that's not calculated by me, but it's calculated by a third party on every report we do. And kind of 50 is the goal, right? Like it's 0 to 100. And if you're at 50, you're doing fine. So I don't know. I feel like investors are starting to be measured on it. I'm not hearing anyway, investors say to me, I'm not investing in the airline industry because of their carbon footprint. I haven't heard that yet. Maybe that's coming. As far as debt goes, I haven't heard that either. I haven't seen airlines be stymied in terms of raising capital by the debt, by ESG, but potentially it's coming. I think we're not, we don't do this, but I think Goldman has a component and when they do IPOs, an evaluation metric that includes diversity and among the board and so on. So I think it's coming for sure if it's not already here.
Yeah, I think I agree. And that, I think that when you look at the lessor side, they say, does it equal basis points on my debt at the moment? It does not, right? But that speaks to probably the amount of capital that's out there. And if that tightens and people are a bit more conscientious about where they put their cash, aviation is going to be challenged. It's never going to be a green investment. And you can speak to new tech all you want. It's not going to answer your problem. Can I bring you back to a point you mentioned at the start, which is a little bit on disruptive technology? So interested to hear the kind of analysis you're putting into aviation in that element, because it just, you talk about it seems very conceptual and very, very far away, but then you see something like eVTOLs, all right, it's a step on what's probably a marathon journey to go on. But just very curious to see what effort you're putting in analyzing that type of space.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Joe. So on that area, to your exact point, we're looking at it from a stepping stone. So we start with ground transportation replacement companies. So let's talk about eVTOL for a minute. You're talking about 4 passenger aircraft with 1 pilot in it. And you're basically talking about going from a downtown area to an airport or vice versa, or from your home to your office, or your office to your vacation home or whatever. I mean, you're not talking great distances, and we're not looking at, replacing a 150 passenger A320 between London and Paris or between New York and Chicago. That's just not here yet. And it's probably not going to be here for a decade at least. We have to first get through the entire approval process and certification process. We haven't even done that yet. Everybody's talking 2024, 2025, depending upon whether you're doing EASA or FAA approval. EASA is a tougher standard. It's 1 accident in a billion versus the FAA is 1 accident in 10 million. So it's a tougher standard. Those seeking to get certified in the United States will have a tougher time getting certified in Europe and elsewhere, but those getting certified in Europe will not have a tougher time getting certified here. Then you have hydrogen aircraft, hydrogen powered aircraft. United just announced recently an investment in Zero Avia and their whole hydrogen powered aircraft. They also announced an investment in Boom which is supersonic, and that's a whole nother discussion. But, again, the idea is to make it a quiet engine. And I think that's the focus. And obviously, my view is it has to come from the manufacturers, it has to come from the airlines. It's kind of a push-pull. We want it, we'll take it, you develop it, we'll buy it. And I think to your point, and the question speaks to timing. I view the 2020s as kind of the era of developing them, figuring out what works, what doesn't, and then the 2030s as innovation, and the 2040s as implementation. So over the next 30 years, between here, 2020 and 2050, 2021, 2050, it's not that far. I know it sounds far. And if you're 30, it is far, but it gets closer every year to where we really need to have a solution that makes both economic sense, and these eVTOLs are supposedly going to be relatively inexpensive. They'll replace some service. I think Hart is looking at a 19-passenger plane. So to your question, you have the 4 passengers, then you have Lilium is developing a 7-passenger aircraft, and then you've got Hart's 19-passenger aircraft. So you're going upscale, which is kind of what happened in the last 40 years in the regional jet market, right? You started with, I think, 13-passenger, 19-passenger planes. You went to 36-seaters, 50-seaters, and the like. And eventually we'll get to replacing those larger aircraft with quieter aircraft. But like I said, I think it's going to be more SAF than it's going to, because I think these initial VTOLs are really ground replacement aircraft rather than aircraft designed to move lots of people between bigger cities.
You can see the logic in that. I think when you look as well, as you say, if you look at what IATA produce and they go, those building blocks that are going to get them to that piece, that bet on SAF is huge.
Right.
And you're kind of hoping, as you say, that you get sufficient supports, but at a government level, really to make production encouraged. And then it just naturally follows through on the commercial side, hopefully. Can I ask you a couple of points to pick up on, Helane, before we wrap? And first, just on the metal side, right? So if you think about, we talked coming out of that ESG chat, narrow body, new tech, new technology, more efficient, and that's where clearly we're seeing that demand piece. Your thoughts on the broader environment for different aircraft types and what that might mean from the financing perspective?
So I think right now there's a lot of financing available, or there seems to be a lot of financing available for the eVTOL companies. And I think that it's going to be billions of dollars. I think some of the folks who have created these companies come from either the auto side or come from tech and don't really understand the level of rigor that it takes to get an aircraft, especially a new aircraft, certified. And I think that's why everybody's going down the path of a pilot rather than autonomous, right? Because I think eventually the manufacturers with whom we speak want these to be autonomous. And we'll see. We'll see how comfortable that is. But anyway, the point is, I think right now there's lots of money available for these guys. And what we've said, my colleague Kai von Rumer, who does the aerospace side and the OEMs, covers Boeing and the other OEMs, he's said what I've said, which is with these companies, whoever has the most money wins, right? You're gonna need a lot of money because it's not up and to the right. It's not a straight line. You're gonna have fits and starts, and you're gonna have to go back to the drawing board and make it work, and so on. And so so it's gonna take a lot of money. And as long as there's capital available, I think you'll have no problem. But he who has the money has the power.
And I can ask you a broader question then around just the investor outlook, right? So have you seen trend lines on investors into aviation over the course of the pandemic, either in the type of capital that has departed the space or the type of capital that has entered the space? Or is it still those traditional type of players we've seen, be that private equity, be that institutional investors that come around the returns or risk levels? What have you seen on the investor side? Has there been differences post-COVID?
Yes, huge. So you have to remember that between 2013 and 2019, there was this whole view among airline investors. I kind of disagreed with the view, but I got where people were coming from, was that airlines would never lose money again, at least US airlines. They would be profitable forever, and they would be able to survive a downturn. And I think that coming into 2020, that's probably true. They probably, if it was a Gordon variety recession, they probably could have, or if there was a rolling pandemic rather than one that hit the whole world at the same time that caused all these government restrictions. I mean, think about it. The governments of the world never shut their borders to pandemics in the past. I'm still not 100% certain why we did the choice we did, because to me it makes no sense, right? You don't get a chance to build herd immunity. I suspect the same number of people would have died anyway, as died given what the shutdown we did. People, still got sick. And by the time you discover that there's a new variant, of course, it's a coronavirus, they mutate. By the time you discover there's a new variant, it's here. So like, why bother? Everybody should get vaccinated. Everybody, and I've always thought vaccination, boosters, and then maybe part of our flu shots every year. I mean, we get a flu shot every year. Like, I don't get it. And I understand not everybody takes the flu shot. I totally get that part. But so with respect to investors, long only fled the space, right? People who would the buy and hold investor totally fled the space right after March of 2020. I mean, they haven't come back. And then during the last year and a half, I suppose, November of last year, there was the whole reopen trade, right? The whole idea of, the pandemic's going to go away or have vaccine, especially right after the first vaccinations were announced. People are going to travel again. Well, that happened, and yet long onlys really haven't. They started to come back, but then you had Delta variant, then you had now you have Omicron variant, and who knows what other variants. I mean, at some point in there was also Lambda and Mu. I know when we were in South America, there was talk of Lambda, but I was just like, I'm not worrying about it. I'm vaccinated, I'm masked, I'm out of here. I'm staying here. Don't worry about it. And it never occurred to me anyway that I would get COVID. So it was like, fine.
All gonna get it, Helane. It's a timing issue. We're all gonna get it.
Yeah, I guess, but like, why? It just doesn't make sense. Like, I get whatever. It's a whole nother discussion. But anyway, so my point here is that long onlys fled the space and haven't really come back. Hedge funds kind of went in, went out, went in. And they're really not involved. I mean, when I think about like who's there to buy the stocks, the traditional airline investors just gone. They're not there, and they may not come back, given how, or they may not. They'll come back eventually, but not in the short term. What we see as passive investors, like if American is part of your benchmark, if airlines are part of your benchmark, it's owning the one that may have the best opportunity for upside, or the one that's the least risky with the best balance sheet. So that might argue for owning a Southwest or a Delta. We have a buy rating on United. So I think that's what we're seeing anyway. And when I talk to the companies and I say, who are you talking to? They're, either nobody, same old suspects. And one of my competitors tried to bring a group to American Airlines headquarters, and one person showed up. I tried to do a in-person event. Nobody wanted to come. We had to move to virtual. Everybody was scared. I'm like, I don't understand. I really don't. I think our governments have done us a great disservice, but that's another story.
No, and I think your point on like restrictions and variants as well made, right? When you even have the World Health Organization very explicitly stating there is little correlation between travel and the spread of this illness. As you say, when you know about a variant, it's probably sitting there within your country. In closing, Helane, can I ask you, as I like to close these interviews on, is your levels of optimism for the broader sector as you look out over 2022, and I should say we're recording this 11 days before Christmas, but as you think out around 2022, how optimistic are you for the wider aviation world?
So I'm going to be really optimistic. I mean, we're pretty bullish on the outlook. I think US domestic is going to be very strong again. I think people, if they're uncomfortable traveling internationally, so where they're uncomfortable internationally is because, or why they're uncomfortable, is because they don't know if there are going to be restrictions put in place while they're gone. Right? Nobody ever says, oh, on, whatever, 10 days from now, we're going to have new restrictions. It's always, we're doing new restrictions right now. And now you're stuck overseas, right? Whether you're traveling in the North Atlantic or traveling within Europe, it's just ridiculous. But anyway, that said, we think US domestic's going to be strong. We think demand on the North Atlantic, especially as people get boosters and as the virus comes and goes, right? Which it does, right? I mean, it comes when you get driven inside, and then it goes when you get to be outside. So why wouldn't the summer be another good? Why wouldn't it be a great summer? I think, man, I'm planning lots of trips. Whether I get to take them or not is another discussion.
You and me both, right? And on that very optimistic note, I'd just like to thank you, Helane, for your time today. As you say, hopefully this is the last time we do this virtually. Look forward to seeing you again in person, and I wish you and Cowen all the best over 2022. Thanks again.
Thanks, Joe. Same to you.